When I was young, I lived in this suburb neighborhood with houses on each side of me. And my Asian parents had a bunch of Asian friends with children my age. So there's maybe about 2 to 4 or 5 families, usually around 2 or 3, that mostly we hung out with, usually on Friday or Saturday nights. It's a very typical Asian thing to do. You've probably heard it too, or you've seen it if you're part of the Asian community, but they would play cards or have a potluck or just hang out and chat. It usually involved some food and cards or just straight up cards. But they loved to play cards, and that was their way of kind of bonding after work, after the work week was done. Simple, yet for them satisfying, actually quite endearing. Now, what's interesting is the kids I hung out with, some were a bit older, some were a bit younger, some were the same age. Now they all live in different states. It seems like as soon as they got to college, they got out of that small hometown area that I lived and the semi boring state I lived in. And now they all live in different states. One's in, I think, Washington, another's in California, another's in California, one's in New Jersey, and so on and so forth. They all got out of there and got close to arguably some of the most attractive metropolises in the country. I mean, no surprise there. Except for me, I ended up going to university in the same state and then getting a job within the same state. And for me, it just felt a lot harder, if not impossible, to escape my state. So in what respect, when you ask the question, is it hard to kind of escape your rural roots and get to an urban area with more opportunity? Yes and no. In this life example, clearly all my immediate colleagues were able to do it. They studied hard in school and they found their way out. And at the same time, it is very difficult because for me, I tried, but, just with my grades and the competition, that was what I could get access to in terms of schooling and then jobs afterwards. Like it or not, employers still to this day will ask to see if you could come in for an in-person interview, ask to see if you live in the state, and all these things can disqualify you. It still happens pretty often. In fact, here's a really big example. So there's this political commentator slash YouTuber. She's now more of like a celebrity gossip commentator. Anyhow, she was in this interview from another podcast, Graham Stephan's Iced Coffee Hour. And she was asked about her current job, which clearly she's making a lot of money. She's pulling millions of views per video. And it's not an independent practice. She works under a actual corporation, the Daily Wire. And she was asked about that and how she got the job. And she said, it's funny because at first I applied for the job, but because I wasn't where the headquarters was, which was in Nashville, Tennessee, it was an immediate qualification. And I believe she mentioned that it was a algorithmic thing, which means it wasn't even, she didn't even get to the point where a human selected it. I believe the way she answered it implied that the computer system where they were servicing job applications found her not to be in that area, and then she got kicked out. Or maybe it was the human afterwards. But the point is, even to this day, this modern age, post-pandemic, where we had moved much more to the virtual side of things and then back again, there's still geographic limitations to breaking out of a city or town. Now, I've had the fortune of traveling, and I detailed this on my secret travel newsletter, but I've had the fortune of traveling all across the country and working remote for last 2 years, and I have lived in been in smaller towns. And one of these towns I passed was Farmington, New Mexico. I lived there for about a week, and it's a nice place. In some ways, similar to back home, even though I lived far away from here, many on different coasts actually. But in terms of a lot of the chain stores I saw here, very similar. It was a very small population, about 45,000. And yet, you walk into a Best Buy, Chick-fil-A, Chipotle, Target, Walmart, Starbucks, it's all the same. However, I just felt like, and this is maybe just my perception, but I felt like there's a slowness to the town, and kind of almost like a glass dome to the town that was kind of similar to what I experienced before. A lot of the population there was ethnic. You could tell they were very Hispanic. And you start to wonder, do people they were born here, they settled here, they couldn't escape here, so they established their roots. And some of them may be happy, but I started to wonder, are there people else out there like me who want to escape their smaller town or mid-sized town vibes, and they can't? And the answer is yes. I've definitely encountered many of them throughout my journeys. And like me, you do what you can. You find happiness with what you can. You find enjoyment with what you can in the city that you are in. And I guess the question is, how hard is it to actually escape these areas? Now, when you look at the statistics about the U.S., people move across states all the time, more so than any other country. When you compare it to other countries who have provinces or states or just regions, the U.S. is a very interesting region country because it is the fourth largest country, and yet we often operate in terms of governmental policy as independent states, and yet there's a lot of movement between them. I mean, everywhere from 0 to 20% of residents, depending on a state, will be flowing in and out and moving elsewhere. So in that way, as I found in my conversations and experience, when you say you're from one state and then you move to a completely different state in a completely different part of the country, usually most Americans don't react with surprise from that. And so in that vein, it's like, oh, okay, it's not a big deal. And yet at the same time, it is a big deal because that still leaves the around roughly 80%, 80 to 80% people who do not move out of the country, out of the state that they were born, And that leads to the question of, why is that the case? Well, some may prefer that state. Wyoming. I love Wyoming. I was born here. My family's here. I want to stay here. I've seen that happen before. I've also seen people from Boston or Chicago or whatnot move to a place, try it out for a while, and then realize, well, I miss my family too much, and then they move back. I've seen that happen for a New Yorker I met in Austin, for someone in Boston who moved to D.C., and so on and so forth. And then there are those like me who were stuck in this area until much later in life, where they got a chance or they never got a chance. I was lucky, if it wasn't for certain few flukes where I started to apply to new jobs and I found something that allowed for remote work, I would have probably stayed in my home state forever, because at the time I was fairly content with my job, and I had worked there for about 5 years and just come to this conclusion that, this is my lot in life. The chances of getting out of it are very unlikely, so might as well make the most of it. And so I think it's tougher than you think, but it's not as hard as you think is my answer. for me, obviously I applied to universities and jobs elsewhere. It's not impossible. Clearly, many people, even family members I know, have done it. And at the same time, it is difficult because college tuition's cheaper in state. Scholarships, better in state usually. Job opportunities, as I mentioned. Some jobs, they still clearly check to see if you're within the state, and then they'll cross-reference that. They will have you come in for an interview. Now, obviously, we're moving and trending towards a better place. Some people have just more lenience, and I'm sure, they'll be open to a virtual interview. And I'm sure, and I've heard this myself through informational interviews, but some people, some candidates will pretend that they are living in that state already when they're not, to get that job interview. And so, there is some leeway there. I had one person who, in his informational interview, I used to do these a lot through LinkedIn to kind of build my network and career knowledge. But he actually recommended that if it comes down to it and the employer from New York asks you, you say yes, you either pretend to be there or you literally fly or drive down there so that you make the interview. If you need to add a house address, you find one, a public facility or something to use as your New York address. Without getting into the semantics of what's the best thing to use for that, like a public library or someone's actual house or an Airbnb house. The point is, there's just some things that you can do, but it's still difficult. And I believe that's why certain people stay in an area. Some are stuck there, and because of our ability as humans to find happiness in almost anywhere, they find contentment with where they are. Whether they're stuck in New Mexico or Wyoming or California, who knows? So how can one, especially someone who's less experienced at escaping their state, do so? I think there's various ways, and you shouldn't just rely on one because there's competition there. If you just rely on remote work, not everyone, but a lot of people want to work remote, and the supply is just not meeting the demand. So that's one way, but what are some other ways of doing it? And I think it all comes down to, when I examine the people who are able to successfully move around, it comes down to their perceived ability in terms of skill set, in terms of brain power, and so forth. So why did those people who I knew who went to college in a different state do so? Well, they had good grades, probably good standardized test scores, and a good essay, which implied that they had desired low supply ability of academic skill set. In the workplace, it's similar, but just work skills instead. Can you succeed in the workplace? Do you have much desired skills? And the fact is that there are companies in whatever state or country or area that are hiring. And sure, spots are limited, but there's still a decent amount, thousands of them. And it is tough, but it's really down to developing the skill sets and experience to which you go through the interview process, you get your foot in the door, and they say, heck yeah, I want to hire this guy. He is outstanding, unique, incredible. And through that, you get the job, you move down there, and boom, you achieved the goal that is insurmountable or perceived to be insurmountable. Now, easier said than done, and so my action plan for you and for me to kind of work on that is to really start mapping out, first off, the states that you want to move to, your dream states, then making sure those are your dream states. If you can take a short trip there to really test out the area, because sometimes, you try a place and it's like, oh, it's really not what I seemed. And then from there, mapping out the companies or the industries in that state that you think would really work for you. And in this process, you also have to factor in the fact that hey, maybe living in your dream state is not your number one priority. Some people care more about just working in a dream industry. And the fact of the matter is, certain states or cities house certain industries. And there's no getting around that, you know. Tech, that's San Francisco. Healthcare, maybe Houston. And then there is some gaming in Raleigh, North Carolina. So you may have to sacrifice a bit. Maybe it's not your first choice of state, but some other things may matter more. And then finally, it's all about getting your foot in the door, networking to possibly go around applying through the front door, because that's always a black hole. You can still make it through the front door, but it's harder than knowing someone. And then trying other means to essentially get the job you want. Now, I'll leave it up to your ethics on whether or not you want to lie about where you're actually housed if it comes down to it and your employer is looking to exclude you simply because you don't live in that state yet. I think that's an unfair practice, but for whatever reason, people still do that. I mean, it's less and less every year, but I mean, it's ridiculous. Even if you say, I'm willing to relocate and I'll pay for the expenses. It's ridiculous, but nonetheless, you know, you make it work. If it is your dream company, your dream job, arguably, and I'm not saying you do or do this, but this is an option on the table. You can say, yeah, I live there, and then take a flight down there to make the interview. So that's it for this video. I found it was a very interesting topic and a dream of mine and other people. Let me know if you have any tips that work for you. Leave a comment on the article version of this podcast episode on my blog at dreamlifelab.org. Thanks for listening.